Hi, I'm Pat. Welcome to Passion of the Geeks Unplugged. Today I want to start another mini-series, Getting into Retro Gaming. And I want to start it with what I think is the easiest system to start your retro gaming journey with. MS-DOS. Or actually, just IBM PC compatible DOS. But I guess most people will be most familiar with Microsoft's version of DOS. But for this episode, you can ignore the brand of DOS because I will focus on the easiest way to play those fantastic DOS games, and that does not involve any hardware. And that is an important point. A lot of very devout retro gamers will tell you that you'll never get the same experience if you don't use real hardware. And, they are partially right. It's certainly something different if you use an old PC and maybe a CRT monitor. The smell and the distinct sound these old computers make, the inconvenience. But that is not what this episode is about. You have just as much fun playing the game with modern means as you had back then. Maybe even more. But I'll get into that a little later. I always considered myself primarily a computer gamer. Sure, I played on and owned various consoles, but until later in my life, they were never in my own room. I think I told back in episode 10 that after the C64, the Amiga was the first computer that was actually in my own room, so I had access to it 24/7. And the same thing was true when I actually switched very gradually to PC as my main gaming platform. So there are many, many nostalgic memories of DOS games, and I still love a lot of them immensely. So, how do you play them easily? Well, the answer is with DOSBox. DOSBox is a DOS emulator that runs on basically every newer system. Windows, Linux, Mac, everything. And it allows you to easily play DOS games without any hassles that plagued the platform back then. No freeing up conventional memory, no fiddling around with interrupts and direct memory access channels or drivers through the config sys and autoexec.bat. All of that is gone. Well, mostly. For a lot of DOS games, you still need to know the DMA, the IRQ, and address of your sound device or virtual sound device. And some games even require you to fiddle around with different memory configurations so the game will run properly. But wait, before you stop this episode, bear with me. It's not that bad, and usually when you Google a specific game's DOSBox settings, you will get it to run within a couple of minutes. The great thing is, you can make a separate config for each game if you want. So you'll always have a perfect configuration. Following the link to DOSBox in the episode description will not only bring you to the emulator itself, but also give you several links to front ends that make your DOSBox usage even easier. A lot of people seem to like Defend Reloaded if they're on Windows, or Boxer if they're on Mac. Configuring DOS games is not rocket science. Don't be afraid to ask Google for help if you need to know something specifically. But let me give you a couple of pointers without going into too much detail. When it comes to graphics, there are roughly 4 standards during the DOS era. CGA, The rather ugly 4-color graphics consisting of either white, magenta, cyan, and black, or white, yellow, green, and black. There are a couple of other modes, but generally, you don't want CGA. The next is EGA. The E stands for enhanced, and it truly is. EGA gives you 16 colors simultaneously, and that can look really well. This is when PCs started to actually be more than just office machines and began to be feasible gaming machines. Then came VGA, and for simplicity's sake, also MCGA. But this is where DOS gaming really began to shine. Breathtaking 256 simultaneous colors. Still mostly in the same low resolution that was used before, 320 to 200 pixels. But through better use of colors, this could be concealed a bit better. Higher resolutions came with Super VGA. Well, sort of. With less colors, higher resolutions were possible before. Well, these are very roughly the 4 graphic standards. And for the moment, that is all you need to know. If the game asks you what kind of graphics you want, well, there you have it. And let's cover sound very, very quickly. The standard for IBM-compatible PCs was the so-called internal speaker, also called the PC beeper or similar things. It's a very simple one-voice and arguably rather shrill sound system that was actually just meant to create audible beeps if something is wrong and no error message could be displayed. There are people who have nostalgic feelings for this kind of music, but honestly, if possible, pick anything else. One sound device that is very often supported is the AdLib. I told a bit about the AdLib in our 26th episode, so if you want to hear an awesome example, I highly suggest listening to that. The AdLib, while not able to produce any digitized sounds way better than a PC speaker. Next is the Sound Blaster. In very simple terms, the Sound Blaster is an AdLib with added digitized sounds. So when using Sound Blaster, you can also select AdLib music. But choosing Sound Blaster as your digital output, you get recorded effects and sometimes even speech. Just don't forget, it took a while for games to actually use digitized sound samples, so earlier DOS games won't have support for them. Just make sure you provide the correct address, IRQ, and DMA if the game does not detect them automatically. These can be found in your DOSBox configuration and usually are address 220, interrupt 5 or 7, and DMA 1. Then there's General MIDI. This produces really nice orchestral sounding music, but again, no sound effects. However, at the time General MIDI was introduced, games usually supported 2 sound cards simultaneously, General MIDI for music and Sound Blaster for sound effects and speech. Lastly, in our sound overview, there is Roland, most often labeled as MT32, but sometimes as CM64 or LIPC1, which is another MIDI standard that sounds awesome. Problem is, for our simple entry into DOS, we need to skip that as you need either hardware or the appropriate emulation with the ROM dumps and stuff, and thus you can't use it even though games will often offer it to you. Maybe we will cover this in a later episode. For most of the games, you should not need to fiddle around more than that. So the problem is now, how do you get games? Now, this being DOS, it is actually fairly easy to transfer your original floppy disks or CDs in your DOSBox folder. Files are compatible with your computer, so no dumping hardware is required. But most modern computers no longer have floppy disk drives. Heck, a lot of computers don't even have a CD drive anymore. In this case, there are often sites on the internet that provide the files for you to download. And I mean, as long as you have the originals, it's not a problem at all. There is, however, the legal gray area of abandonware. And I have to speak about that. In layman's terms, abandonware are games that no longer have someone holding the rights to them. Or so they say. In reality, usually someone somewhere still has those rights. And as long as a game is not publicly announced as being made freeware or open source or public domain, downloading abandonware without having the original game is still technically illegal, even if you might not be sued. But you know what? You don't need abandonware. There are many freeware and shareware DOS games out there, especially shareware that often give you a third of the entire game for free and ask you to buy the other 2/3 later. But more often than not, for many shareware titles, the first third might be enough to quench that thirst. Also, many shareware titles have become freeware or public domain. And if you want a full game, one you no longer have or never had in your library, well, I got you covered. There are places nowadays where you can buy retro games digitally and you get them completely configured with DOSBox included. The best place for this is GOG.com. I mean, there is a reason why GOG was originally called Good Old Games. They do a really great job. Their support is fantastic. They provide all manuals and sometimes even hint books and similar goodies. And they are completely DRM free. They also have their own launcher called Galaxy, which makes everything even easier. Steam also offers a lot of retro games that most of the time also come with a pre-configured DOSBox included. Steam doesn't provide just as much love and care as GOG does, but it's a viable source for old games. All right then, there is one little thing left you need to be aware of when playing old DOS games. As I've said, most DOS games were low resolution. This means it will look very blocky to you at first. Maybe you'll even be disappointed because it looks so much worse than you remember. Well, that's the problem with nostalgia. But also with modern technology. Our modern displays are just too sharp with high definition. Upscaled pixels are therefore razor sharp and incredibly blocky. And it doesn't look at all like it did back then. I mean, there are a lot of people that still want the unaltered picture, even if it actually does not look like back then at all. And if you feel that way, be my guest, do it. Just remember, your brain needs a while to kind of switch back from HD mode to low res. Allow your brain a couple of minutes and it will start filling the gaps and kind of internally upscale and smoothen the picture. It works, trust me. Give it time. Also, DOSBox offers some filters that smoothen the picture a bit and will be closer to what the picture actually used to be on these old CRT monitors. Some filters try to smoothen by simple bilinear filtering, some by calculating a sort of color bleed old monitors had. Go through them, pick the one you like the most. Don't listen to anyone, but always test it for a couple of minutes before switching to another filter. There is also the option of using more intelligent CRT emulation shaders, but that is not part of this episode, and honestly, even if they look awesome, I think they often do too much. Lastly, using DOSBox allows you to do a couple of things that is not possible with real hardware. First, disk access and loading times are quicker than on real hardware, but it gives you the opportunity to actually decide how fast a game should be by limiting or increasing its CPU cycles. Most of the time, the auto setting is fine, but sometimes a little more control adds a lot of playability. As I mentioned before, you can use basically any virtual hardware that the game needs hassle-free. And just as hassle-free, use a modern gamepad to control your old DOS games. Plus, even if they don't support a joystick, you can easily map keyboard keys with the internal mapper, accessed by pressing Ctrl F1, to your gamepad and thus make the game even easier. I love the DOS era of games. There's so many classics, and especially a lot of great point-and-click adventures. Though a lot of them can be played with ScumVM, even more hassle-free. But that is a topic for another episode. So, this is it for this week. If you liked this episode of Passion of the Geeks Unplugged, then let me know what you think through Twitter at PassionOTGeeks or by mail to passionofthegeeks@gmail.com. Or you can reach me directly on Twitter at pat9496. We're on all major podcasting services and, of course, on www.passionofthegeeks.com and on YouTube. So, thank you for listening and take care.